Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband. In each midweek episode, we will be marvelling at glorious pearls of contemporary British political interest.
First of all, we wanted to say thank you to everybody who listened and shared some feedback on our recent episode about the Profumo scandal, really the benchmark for political crisis in British political history. If you've not yet heard that, it's available wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also listen to it ad-free on our Patreon, where you'll also find some bonus episodes as well. There's a link to that in the show notes. But Richard, why don't you kick off this week's Matters of Interest with what's caught your attention recently? And I've got a feeling it might be something to do with the Labour leadership.
Yes, it is, Lee. At the start of the week, it looked like, as Ed Miliband himself described, the Prime Minister was looking over the precipice of his own leadership. And there was speculation that Keir Starmer would be challenged as Prime Minister and leader of the Labour Party, or indeed would resign from that position. And that got me thinking about what would happen if Keir Starmer just packed it all in. I'm not saying this is at all likely, but just imagine for a moment that the pressure was so intense on Keir Starmer, or the level of scandal rose to a condition where the Prime Minister's position was untenable, not simply in the situation the Prime Minister saying, I'm going to resign and I will remain Prime Minister until you elect my successor, but I'm actually going to resign here and now as leader of the Labour Party and as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Who would replace him? And the answer is not actually that straightforward. You might first think, oh, well, he would be replaced by the deputy leader of the Labour Party who would assume the role of acting leader. And that is, of course, happened in many instances in Labour history where the incumbent leader has resigned and the deputy has become acting leader. Clement Attlee became acting leader in 1935 when George Lansbury resigned. Attlee actually led Labour into the 1935 election as acting leader. He wasn't even the elected leader of the Labour Party. In 1963, George Brown became acting leader when Hugh Gateskill died. In 1994, Margaret Beckett became acting leader when John Smith died. And in 2010 and 2015, Harriet Harman became acting leader when Gordon Brown and Ed Miliband resigned before waiting for the election of their successor. But the rules of the Labour Party say something rather different when it's an incumbent Labour Prime Minister who resigns. In fact, in that instance, the deputy leader does not automatically become the acting leader and acting Prime Minister. This is what the rules of the Labour Party say. When the party is in government and the party leader is Prime Minister and party leader, and for whatever reason becomes permanently unavailable, resigns, obviously this could also be if they died or became very ill, the Cabinet shall, in consultation with the NEC, appoint one of its members to serve as party leader until a ballot under these rules, i.e. the normal rules of a Labour leadership contest, can be carried out. Well, that immediately rules out the current deputy leader of the Labour Party, Lucy Powell, because she is not in the cabinet. And so in this scenario, if Starmer said to the King, right, that's it, I'm calling it a day and I'm leaving, then the cabinet would have to immediately convene. There's an interesting question as to who would chair that cabinet in absence of the Prime Minister. And then the cabinet would, presumably by majority vote, have to elect someone from the cabinet to be acting leader and therefore acting Prime Minister. We don't really have a constitutional position of acting Prime Minister, so they would be Prime Minister, full belt and braces. They would have to then get approval from the Labour NEC, and that raises the interesting question, well, what would happen if the cabinet voted for someone and then the NEC said, we don't approve of that person? So this is a scenario that has never happened in the history of the Labour Party or indeed in British politics before and under these kind of rules. And I'm not saying that it's a likely thing to happen, but it is worth talking about. And I've heard a couple of commentators pick up on this week. Sam Coates for Sky News did comment on this. I don't quite agree with the way that he thinks it would pan out, but I'm glad that there are some people who are looking at the vagaries of the Labour rulebook and how they intersect in quite sometimes uncomfortable ways with the British Constitution.
Gosh, there's a huge amount in that for us to try and unpack, I suppose. One of them is this very idea of a caretaker or acting prime minister. Almost every time you get to the downfall of a premiership, the idea gets mooted, usually by the friends and allies of somebody who fancies themselves as being a caretaker prime minister, I think. But it happened, say, in the downfall of Boris Johnson, when there was the mass walkout from the ministerial ranks. Some people tried to suggest that actually the removal of confidence through those resignations in Johnson as a prime minister was so profound that it would be impossible for him to remain in office, even just for that remaining period of time until a new party leader and therefore a new prime minister was chosen. But of course, that didn't happen. The idea of a caretaker prime minister has never actually happened, to my knowledge, at all in our history. We have had caretaker governments, and that, of course, is a slightly different idea. So, for example, when the national government resigned shortly before the 1945 election, and there just became a majority Conservative government between the end of the wartime coalition and the result of the 1945 election. That was a caretaker government in effect, but still under the same prime minister. And if we use the more contemporary example that I just mentioned then about Boris Johnson, really his government that he put back together between July and September, which had, if you remember, some pretty unusual picks for ministers. Peter Bone, for example, became a minister during that time because so many people walked out from government and refused to serve as the Boris Johnson premiership was coming to an end. And some of them went back on the basis that he was now going. I think Robert Buckland, for example, did that. But quite a lot of them, people like Rishi Sunak and others, didn't go back. They just stayed on the back benches and, in his case, fought a leadership election. So Johnson ended up having to find some kind of unusual people, should we say, not necessarily from the top flight of the Conservative Parliamentary Party, to staff his government for what was basically this caretaker period in office. You mentioned several times, Richard, when the Labour leader became, in the words of the present rulebook, permanently unavailable. Of course, in Hugh Gateskill's case, he died. In John Smith's case, he died. And Labour was lucky, I suppose, in one sense, that those tragedies occurred in opposition, not in government, because it's easier to just have an acting leader and all of the stakes are much lower. But of course, it doesn't rule out the fact that something like that, or the Prime Minister simply saying, right, well, I am off, rather like Ed Miliband did in 2015. I'd actually forgotten that until you mentioned it, that Ed Miliband didn't just announce that he was resigning in the aftermath of that election. He waited until shortly after the anniversary celebrations for VE Day and then just went, left before a new leader was chosen.
It was so irresponsible and so out of keeping with the traditions of the party. Gordon Brown resigned because he actually used that as a bargaining chip in the coalition negotiations and basically said, look, I will resign as Labour leader. There will be a Labour leadership contest to replace me, and that will be the person who will then lead us into a election later this year if the Lib Dems go into coalition with us. So he sacrificed himself. Miliband just couldn't bear, I think, the humiliation of having lost. But other leaders like Michael Foot or Neil Kinnock, after they lost, they didn't just cut and run like Ed Miliband. They announced their resignation and they then waited until their successor was elected, and then they stood down.
Oh, it would be the ordinary thing to do. If you look at Tony Blair's first Prime Minister's questions, the person asking him the questions is John Major. Talk about humiliating. You've just been routed in an election. You're on the opposition benches. But he did it. Ditto Rishi Sunak did it after 2024. An even more humiliating situation given the nadir that he led the Conservative Party into. What I wanted to go on to, though, Richard, what I wanted to ask you about is you have the traditions and the working of the British Constitution, whether that's in convention, whether that's in present-day understanding, whether that's in the Cabinet Manual, whether that's in the collective wisdom of people in Buckingham Palace and the King's advisors and all the rest of it. And then alongside that, you've got the Labour Party rulebook. And this seems to be an example where Labour isn't just trying to say what its internal rules are about who is its leader, but Labour seems to be actually trying to say how the British Constitution ought to work through its rulebook. And that doesn't really seem a satisfactory or harmonious way of organising these things.
Well, yes, so it does raise an interesting scenario. What if when Keir Starmer said, look, I've had enough, I'm packing it in, he goes to the palace to resign there and then, and in his final meeting with the king, he says, and I nominate as my successor, and let's just use it for the sake of the example, Lucy Powell. I mean, I doubt he would.
that would be a staggering turn.
But let's just say he did. Okay, he'd say, I nominate my deputy to become. I advise the king to invite my deputy Lucy Powell to form a new administration and to become prime minister. Well, that's fine, potentially, but under the rules of the Labour Party, she's not in the cabinet. So maybe by becoming prime minister, she kind of leaps over that, and then she's in the cabinet, and then the cabinet can retrospectively approve her as the Labour leader, but that would be quite a complicated affair. Or what if the prime minister said, I advise the king to appoint as my successor Rachel Reeves, and the cabinet does not want Rachel Reeves to become prime minister? Well, what happens in that situation? I mean, if the cabinet, let's say the cabinet could be meeting almost simultaneously, or if the cabinet has its own vote according to the Labour rulebook, and they vote to make Wes Streeting the Labour leader according to the rules of the Labour Party, and let's say the NEC gives them the thumbs up, well, then you have the situation where cabinet has chosen Wes Streeting to be leader of the Labour Party. Keir Starmer has advised the king to appoint Rachel Reeves as the new prime minister. Would the king feel bound to follow the advice of Keir Starmer, or would the king feel bound to follow the advice of the Labour cabinet? Now, I think often constitutional theorists in this scenario would say, well, whoever can command a majority in parliament. Well, what if both can? Then I don't know.
Yes, because it's worth saying the cabinet is serving a dual function there. One, it's got this purpose within the Labour rulebook, but also the cabinet, in a slightly looser sense, also has a purpose within the Constitution around the choice of successor. So they are, for the most part, and with a couple of exceptions, the most senior Labour parliamentarians in the country. And historically, that has carried great weight in terms of what their opinions are, and therefore what the palace and the sovereign think about possible successors. So we think about something like 1963, when Harold Macmillan resigns and the Earl of Hume, Alec Douglas Hume, becomes his successor. He doesn't become an acting prime minister, but he almost becomes a conditional prime minister, in the sense that the Queen says to him, I'm going to ask you to form a government, but I need to know that you can form a government. And the test for that wasn't something like a confidence vote. You know, the Commons didn't meet and vote on whether or not they had confidence in a Douglas Hume-led government. The test of that was, could he get a sufficient number of the existing cabinet, Macmillan's old cabinet, to support him? And we've done a podcast in this in the past that people could listen to. Rab Butler basically becomes the key figure in that. And only two of the cabinet say no. The rest agree to serve, and therefore he formally becomes prime minister the very next day. So the cabinet does have this important role also within the constitution, not just within the rule book. One of the things they also wanted to comment on, I mean, there's so much going on with these scenarios and all the rest of it, but we do have this idea that the prime minister gets to advise the monarch on who their successor should be. I think it's a nonsense. Churchill thought it was a nonsense as well, for what it's worth. He said at one stage that he did not think it was at all credible. So, of course, even though the Constitution has evolved in different ways since then, Starmer wouldn't have, I don't think, the ability to advise the king with a capital A on who it is he should pick in a way that the king would be obliged to accept.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I think that there's nothing stopping the outgoing prime minister from giving the king advice, but it's not as you say, advice with capital A that the king is duty bound to follow. But at the same time, I think it's not necessarily advice that the king should simply disregard either. And that potentially could be a factor maybe in shaping the decision made by the cabinet if it's known that this is the advice that the prime minister's given. On the other hand, maybe the cabinet just thinks, sod that, we're gonna choose who we want to choose and we don't care what Starmer thought. I have a couple other thoughts to raise here. So the first is what actually would likely happen in this scenario? Who would be chosen? And at the moment, one of the major contenders for the premiership, Angela Rayner, would be shut out of this because she's on the backbenches and she's not in the cabinet. I think the person who would argue that they should be chosen would be David Lammy as the deputy prime minister, even though the deputy prime minister role doesn't carry some kind of automatic line of succession function in the way that, say, a vice president of the United States does. Lammy, I think, would argue vigorously that it should be understood that as deputy prime minister, he should effectively step in for the prime minister.
Just on that very point as well, there is a cabinet order of precedence. George Osborne spoke about this on the podcast he hosted a little while back, where there is effectively a number next to each member of the cabinet, which signifies where they are in the hierarchy. And even though you're right to say deputy prime minister is this slightly nonsense title, and some of the historical reflections of the powerlessness of the role from the people who have been awarded it are so often quite funny to read. But nevertheless, Lammy does have the number 2 next to his name, so he is second in command in at least that respect.
And then there are rumors at the time of recording this podcast that Starmer is considering bringing Angela Rayner back into the cabinet and appointing her once again First Secretary of State, which has been seen as the most senior member of the cabinet after the prime minister. Again, not sort of officially, but that's sort of how it's been understood. And then you would have a situation where you would have in the cabinet, presumably, David Lammy as deputy prime minister and Angela Rayner as First Secretary of State. And both of those would argue that they are unofficially next in line behind the prime minister. The usual practice is that you have either one or the other. There has been at least one example where those roles have been combined with John Prescott as both First Secretary of State and Deputy Prime Minister. There's only one instance where you've had 2 different people hold those roles in the cabinet, and that was in the 2010 to 15 coalition, where the Deputy Prime Minister was the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Nick Clegg, and the First Secretary of State was the Foreign Secretary, William Hague. So that would cause some confusion, potentially.
And in that case, it made perfect sense, of course, because you have a coalition partner who wants the dignity and the respect of a title like Deputy Prime Minister, which is what Nick Clegg gets. But if David Cameron fell under a bus, then his successor, even if the coalition continued, would have been a Conservative, because that was, of course, the overwhelming majority of the coalition government was made up of Conservative MPs. So in that sense, having a different Deputy Prime Minister to First Secretary of State was exactly as it ought to have been. If it were to happen in this case, I think it would rather suggest a slightly muddled way of thinking about who's in government and where they sit in the order of precedence.
When I tweeted about this earlier this week, I got some really interesting engagement, and it's very nice. But I did also get some rather hostile engagement about this from people who said, Keir Starmer would never do this. It's not even worth thinking about. It's not even worth discussing. Put down the crack pipe. Maybe not, but maybe he would. And one of the reasons why he might do it is to stop Angela Rayner from becoming prime minister. Because let's assume he doesn't put Angela Rayner into the cabinet, and therefore she remains on the backbenches. This may be one of his only opportunities, if he realizes he's going to have to resign, to stop her from becoming Labour leader. Because if he resigns as leader and prime minister simultaneously, she's not eligible to become prime minister there and then. Someone else from the cabinet will do. Now, that then opens up a normal Labour leadership election. But it may well be that there's a judgment made that Labour MPs don't think it would be good for the country to have 3 prime ministers in as many months, which might happen under this scenario. And so they basically agree not to nominate anyone for the leadership, which happened in 2007, where no candidate other than Gordon Brown was able to get the nominations. John McDonnell tried, Michael Meacher tried, they were both unsuccessful. And so that could be a way of kind of blocking out an Angela Rayner premiership from happening, where if Keir Starmer just said, I'm staying on as prime minister, but I'm resigning as leader of the Labour Party, that would then open up the normal process there and then, and you wouldn't have this weird situation of 3 prime ministers in 3 months. And that was where I disagreed with Sam Coates, because his presumption, I think, was that you would have to have that. You'd have to have 3, basically, that sort of person chosen by the cabinet would not then stay on as leader beyond that sort of interim period. Whereas I think actually there's a very good chance that whoever the cabinet chose in that moment would be Labour leader and prime minister potentially for the rest of this parliament.
I agree with that. I actually think that's why the idea of a caretaker prime minister has never taken off, because it's only really in the interest of one person, the person who becomes caretaker PM. It's not in the interest of the outgoing prime minister, because of course people like to have the baubles of office for a little bit longer. And usually for that lame duck period of time, shall we say, between announcing resignation and actually leaving office, there's quite a lot of stuff that you can do without necessarily the full scrutiny of media attention on you. But the other reason why I've always thought it's very unlikely to happen is that it doesn't suit anybody else at the top table who's got ambitions, for the very reason that you mentioned. That by the time, let's just play it out slightly, Keir Starmer goes to the palace, resigns, by whatever of the slightly conflicting mechanisms or processes that we've discussed, somebody emerges. And the idea is that there will be a caretaker PM whilst the leadership election goes on. By the time that they've gone to the palace, kissed hands upon their appointment as Prime Minister, come back, advise the King on who to appoint into a new cabinet potentially, probably address the nation somewhere behind a lectern or behind a desk and seem very authoritative. And then you've gone through this period of churn and chaos, because as we've seen in recent years, and as I think we're probably seeing at the moment, the removal of a prime minister is a really unsettling and bloody process to go through. But by the time you're at the end of that and you've got somebody who's in office again, even if they're to go voluntarily as part of a transition of power with a leadership election, the idea that you would then have another year of 3 prime ministers, something that's only ever happened twice before in our country's history, 1868 and appallingly 2022, when the dreadful error of making Liz Truss Conservative leader and prime minister took place. The idea that you would then have this person who is given this status, has some of this authority, appoints a new government, and then say, oh, we're just going to change it all over again. I actually think it would be seen as an indulgence by much of the country, and that there would be a move, not least by the supporters of the caretaker prime minister, to basically say, well, look, let's just draw the line here now. Swallow your ego. We've got a job to do. We can't put the governance of the country on the back burner in order just to have this internal leadership election. So that is why it'll probably be very, very unlikely to ever happen. I think because that is the person that would benefit most, the caretaker PM, and almost nobody else in the process.
Well, I agreed with you pretty much until the end of that monologue there, Lee, where I think there are some interests beyond that individual at play. I mean, if we're to play out what I think is the most likely scenario, which is that David Lammy would be the figure chosen by the cabinet, maybe at the time they wouldn't necessarily think that they were choosing someone who'd be there for the long run, but for the reasons you say, it would develop in that way. And I think from Keir Starmer's perspective, as I understand it, I don't know this for a fact, he and Lammy are quite close. And I don't think if someone had to replace him, I don't think Starmer would lament Lammy replacing him in a way in which I think he would not want Angela Rayner to replace him. I actually think he probably doesn't want Wes Streeting to replace him. And so this would be Starmer's way of blocking two figures from succeeding him who are very likely to succeed him if the choice is taken out of cabinet. But I think this would be the one scenario where he could actually stop them. And that would be really quite a tremendous legacy of his in a way to, in effect, maneuver so that this otherwise unexpected figure, David Lammy, would become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And I think Starmer might smile on that a bit. Okay, Lee, what's your matter of interest this week?
Well, this week I wanted to talk about a slightly different sense in which trust and confidence in politics and politicians has been declining. I'll tell you the very particular and personal reason why I thought about this recently, but then I want to think about something more general. So we had Budget Council in Oxfordshire County Council this week, and we had lots of comments from councillors of all political persuasions about how important it is, for example, to have well-maintained roads, something I should say we do not have here in Oxfordshire. And then when there was an amendment to put more funding into the roads, the majority of the parties voted against it. And there are political judgments and balances about what may have been cut to fund that, etc., which people will take. And I'm not trying to relitigate a vote that I happened to lose just the other day in County Hall. But what it got me thinking about as I was sat there in the council chamber the other day is that everybody in that chamber would go to their residents and say that they think it's really important to invest in and fix our roads. It's almost like a shibboleth for people in local government. If you want to get elected, talk about the importance of roads. But are they actually willing to do difficult things, or even just not especially easy or obvious things, in order to bring it about? And part of my criticism is that they're not. And I think this is a general trend that we see in our politics, where people offer platitudes about a certain set of institutions or a certain group of people, which are very easy to say, but do not always follow through on what would actually make those words a reality. So let me take an example I care about quite a lot, the state of the high street in this country. So we're now at a point, and we have been for decades, this isn't a partisan point about the present government or an attack on the last government. This has been part of a process going on now for a very long time, where there are plenty of towns and villages and even some cities in this country where you will walk down high streets that basically feel dead, or to the extent that they have life in them, it's dominated by charity shops who benefit from particular tax status that helps them keep going after commercial businesses have gone, or takeaways, or a few other types of shops. Alongside that, you have in every city, town, and village of this country vans with the branding of a South American river on the side, a company that is owned by a multi-billionaire, a company that doesn't pay anything like as much tax in this country or lots of other countries as it ought to, a company that doesn't pay its staff and its workers as much money as it ought to, in my view. And what we have is a political class that has allowed these two things to happen simultaneously. High streets to be relatively highly taxed to the point that lots of them are dying, and the arrangements for online companies like Amazon to be relatively lightly taxed to the point that they thrive whilst high streets die. And like I say, no politician in the country says that's what they want. But over decades, cumulatively, that's what our political class has given us. And it's not unavoidable. There are difficult decisions that you could take about how to do it. You could cut public expenditure in one area in order to massively reduce the tax burden that is faced by pubs and shops on the high street and small businesses. You could take on big multinational online businesses. You could slap them with additional rates of taxation. You could put in their way additional charges, etc., to try and level the playing field between them and local corner shops. The issue is that we've not had politicians or governments that have been willing to do those things because they're all difficult. They all require making big arguments, long term arguments. In lots of cases, they require saying to people that this way of buying things that's very easy. You go online, you click some buttons, it turns up at your door the next day, is not long term socially or economically desirable. And therefore, we have to try and disincentivize it if we're to try and preserve something else or create something else on high streets that is worth having. All of these require making big and brave political arguments, but our political class hasn't been willing to do that. And I think we need braver politicians willing to make long-term arguments and willing to risk unpopularity for the sake of those arguments if we're to actually get the sort of future that we actually want in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree that politicians should be much bolder, and I would hope, as a socialist, that this Labour government would be much bolder than it is, and would be much more economically interventionist than it is. I think when it comes to national government, I think that, of course, there are constraints, but I think many of those constraints are more artificially imposed by policymakers than need be. And that is where I think policymakers are, in some cases, looking to be bound in their decisions or looking to be restrained in their positions, whether that's through a complex web of regulation that is then used to try to create processes that take away those hard choices from politicians. So that, I mean, Keir Starmer is a classic example of this. He doesn't really talk about making a choice and going for that choice. He talks about, well, this is what the consultation has brought up, or this is what the process will arrive at, and we are waiting for the report that comes out on this so that we can then follow the recommendations of the report and so on. And I think that's really problematic. I think another way in which politicians constrain themselves is by subscribing to truisms of orthodox economics, which take the view that, for example, I read a piece by a very learned colleague of mine recently about how the British economy is at full capacity. Well, only if you subscribe to certain orthodox economic presumptions it is, but we should challenge those. And the reason that matters is because then the claim is that as a government spends more, it leads to higher inflation. Therefore, the government should not spend more in the economy. Well, I just reject that kind of framework. But but a lot of very sensible people say that that is the case. Those are the rules of economics, and therefore we must follow them. And therefore we cannot have more intervention in the economy from the government because it will lead to rampant inflation, etc. Well, let's rethink those things and actually let's challenge those things, and let's not just assume that these things are always true. And I think a final way that I'll mention where I think politicians artificially constrain themselves is by not wishing to have those fights and not having to pick winners and losers and just trying to skirt around, and leads to what in the public policy literature we call policy drift, where there's perhaps piecemeal improvisation at best, but actually a failure to confront a policy challenge because of the political costs of doing so, or the political dangers of doing so. What's rather interesting about this Labour government is that there have been times when the government has been picking sides, and you can see that, for example, in the education policies of Bridget Phillipson, where she came in and said, I'm going to tax private schools in order to pay for more state school teachers. Or when you had the family farm tax, as it became known by its opponents, but basically trying to remove the loophole for wealthy landowners who don't have to pay inheritance tax. And that could have been framed as about fairness in the tax system, not just about hitting wealthy landowners, but then using those funds to pay for, I mean, the classic thing seemed to be breakfast clubs was the thing the government was talking about. I'm not against doing that. I think the government should do lots of things like that. You've given different examples. I know you don't agree with the policies that I've just described, but you've given different examples about we tax Amazon to provide subsidy or some kind of more favorable tax regime for high street shops. Great ideas. The problem that the government, I think, has had on this is that they haven't shown A, enough conviction and follow through on these policies, B, haven't been very good at explaining what they're trying to do, or C, have designed the policies in ways that are quite badly designed, which then undermines the deeper purpose for why they're doing it, because then they have to backtrack or modify the policy announcements, as they have done in the case of the inheritance tax reforms for landowners, and the private school fee policy seems to have actually put greater pressure on the state sector. So it's not clear that that's actually improved the quality of education in the state sector.
You're right. I disagree with both of those policies on education and about family farms. But one thing I would at least say for them is that if you were to do what I would like a government to do, which is basically sit down and say, how do we imagine this country looking in a decade's time or 25 years' time? And therefore, how do we chart a path towards that? Then, well, they are both things that a socialist government might do. It might go after people who own, comparative to the average person, large chunks of land. It might go after private schools. Again, not things that I agree with, but they might be things that socialist governments do where they see that as being part of their longer term vision. The bit that really bugs me is that I see so little of this long term vision, basically. And it's almost as if things going wrong or issues getting worse happens so incrementally that at no stage does somebody really wake up to what's going on until actually you look back and you realize, oh, the high streets are dead. Or, oh, this town that used to have 15 pubs has now only got two. Politicians aren't willing to actually back up the things that they say with the policies that would deliver them in lots of cases.
And sometimes in politics, you just want to have the fight. Actually, if you have the right enemy, proverbially speaking, the public will back you even if you fail, I think. If you're shown to have, in good faith, with genuine conviction, tried to solve an issue, and you've picked a problem, a parasitical feature of our economy or society, and tried to really tear that off, so to speak, even if you only kind of partially do it, then I think there is some kind of congratulations for that. I mean, obviously, very controversial issue, but Trump's base have given Trump a lot of credit on the immigration issue, even if he's not actually completely delivered on what he said, but he's been very good at that kind of framing. Or equally, I think when Jeremy Corbyn was at his height, he was very good at framing a story about who Labour was for, but also who Labour was against, right? That message of for the many, not the few. It wasn't just for the many, full stop. That not the few contained a set of enemies, in a sense, that could be used as part of the framework for this kind of rhetoric that then helped to explain, justify, and propel the policies that Labour was advocating in the 2017 election. And had it not been for the dastardly Ruth Davidson in Scotland and the Tory partial revival in Scotland in 2017, then Theresa May would not have had enough MPs with the Conservatives plus the DUP to form a ministry. And I don't know if Jeremy Corbyn necessarily would have become Prime Minister there, but he really actually came very, very close in 2017 on over 40% of the vote, something that obviously Keir Starmer is now struggling to even get half that level of support at the moment. And Corbyn's 40% in 2017 is the highest share of the vote that any Labour leader has received in a British election since 2001, since before 9/11.
And I think, just to wrap this up, it's too late for Starmer to do this now. But if you take an example of where Starmer could have picked an enemy to have a fight with where the public would have backed him, water companies.
Yeah.
There's not a single person in this country that I've ever met anyway who likes water companies.
Yeah.
And hardly anybody doesn't feel like they're being fleeced by them and isn't outraged by the fact that the infrastructure is so poor that there's leaks all the time and there's sewage in rivers. This is a national scandal, and the government could have gone after them and gone to war with them. And we're willing to have a fight, including a fight about compensation for shareholders, who most of the public think have already had their share and the rest, and don't necessarily deserve compensation in the event of nationalisation or these companies collapsing and the state having to step in. But instead, what we had was, oh, we're strengthening the powers of the regulators, or we're having a report on X or Y. It's not interesting. It's not inspiring politics. It's not actually substantive and going to make a difference to anything. But that is instead the rut that lots of politics has gotten into, and that Keir Starmer in many ways typifies. Anyway, that's all for this week's Matters of Interest. We'll be back on Sunday with our next main edition of the podcast. As ever, if you enjoy listening to the podcast, we'd be very grateful if you left us a review, wherever it is that you get your podcast from. We'll see you on Sunday.
Thanks very much.